In this recorded lecture, I'm going to talk about what is DNA. As usual, I'm going to go over the learning objectives for this video. So this lecture will help you explore the wide range of microbes that make the human body home, and it will also help when we talk about the learning objective in which we'll be discussing Western medical practices such as antibiotic use, cesarean births, and infant feeding practices. A quick overview of what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about what DNA is, what DNA does in the cell, what protein does in the cell, and then of course I will have a summary. So what is DNA? You've probably heard of it, and you probably have no idea what it is. But it is the blueprint of the cell. It's all of the instructions for how to build stuff in the cell, and I'll go into that in more detail on the next slide. It codes for all the structures in the cell. So if you don't have DNA that tells you how to make it or to do it, it's not going to happen in the cell. And when a cell divides, a complete copy of all the DNA in the cell is passed on to baby cells. That happens in both asexual reproduction, when cells just divide and make an exact copy of themselves, and this also happens in what we call vertical gene transmission. In other words, I have received one complete copy of all the DNA that my parents have, and that is vertical. It's coming down to me. Now, bacteria, interestingly enough, do something called horizontal gene transfer, where just pieces of DNA, not the complete copy of the DNA in the cell, is passed between bacterial cells. They don't have to be related. They don't even have to be the same species. This becomes important when we talk about antibiotic resistance. And this is horizontal gene transfer. In other words, gene transfer that's not from parent to child. In other classes, you'll learn about the actual physical structure of the DNA, how it replicates itself, all sorts of good stuff, but for this class, what you really need to know is what I've told you. So, let's go on to what DNA does in the cell. Now, I have an analogy that I like to use that helps make this all less abstract. Suppose I want to build a table. I've gone furniture shopping, it's all too expensive, besides I think it would be a fun project. So I go to the library and I look for a book on basic carpentry because, you know, I'm not a carpenter, I need something simple. So from there, you know, I don't want to get sawdust all over the book. You know, I might get, you know, who knows what on the book, and then I'll have to pay for it. So I make copies of the chapter on how to build a table, and that's what I use in my garage with my circular saw and all of that good stuff. And I use that disposable copy of the chapter in the book to make an actual table. Now, the book from the library and my photocopies of the chapter are all information. It's information on how to do something. The table is what the information tells me how to do. Okay. Now, from another place, you know, I went to the hardware store to get the boards and the wood and the tools and all sorts of stuff. There's information on how to cut wood and how to make the tools that I needed. Okay. That would come from another information source. And we're going to say that all that information is in the United States Library of Congress. Okay? Now, let's apply this to what's happening in the cell. DNA is the Library of Congress for the cell. It has the information for all of how to do stuff, how to make tools, how to make the lumber that would go into a structure in a cell. That's DNA. Now, DNA is protected because you don't want to get sawdust on it. You don't want it to get damaged. When it gets damaged, sometimes you get mutations. You've probably heard of that. Mutations are a permanent change in the DNA. Sometimes it kills the cell. Sometimes it doesn't do anything. Sometimes it's better. But we want to protect the DNA. So we make a disposable copy, which is RNA, which is like my disposable copy that I made of the book. And proteins are the things that are made from the information on the RNA. Now, let's go ahead and talk about what proteins do in the cell. So, protein either does stuff or is stuff. Yes, I'm being exceptionally vague on that one. I don't want to go into too much detail while we're laying a foundation of knowledge as to what protein does in the cell. Let's use an example of protein doing stuff. By the way, most of the time for proteins that do stuff, in this class, most of them are going to be enzymes. So let's talk about what an enzyme is. But first, let's talk about a simple carbohydrate, lactose. Now, lactose is milk sugar. Those of you who are lactose intolerant know very well what I'm talking about. There is an enzyme called lactase that acts like a pair of scissors. They're really not shaped like scissors, but they do the same job. And what lactase does is it snips lactase into two even more simple carbohydrates, or sugars, called galactose and glucose. And your cells use those to make energy. So if you don't have lactase, you can't snip lactose into galactose and glucose, and you are considered lactose intolerant. So let's talk about another kind of protein. Okay, we've got another enzyme. We've got an enzyme, and I'm going to use a hammer here because we're going to be putting units of glucose together in a long chain. So I line up my units of glucose and I take my enzyme that acts kind of like a hammer, and I'm going to nail these together. Well, this is the first stage in making peptidoglycan, which is the major component in bacterial cell walls. And we have antibiotics that inhibit the action of the enzyme that helps make peptidoglycan. Okay, now that is an example of protein that does stuff. Two different enzymes. Now, if we have a protein that is structural, an example of that would be the flagella on a bacterium. Now, a flagella is this kind of hair-like extension that comes off the cell. It zips around like a little outboard motor, and it helps the bacterium move. And it's made up of proteins called flagellin. That is a protein that is stuff. It's a structural protein. It is a part of the cell. And enzymes are used to build that as well. And the information to make these enzymes and to make the parts of structural proteins within the cell all come from genes, which are composed of DNA. Well, that's it for now on this. Here's a summary of what I wanted you to learn from this recorded lecture. DNA codes for proteins. Proteins do stuff and they form structures in the cell. An introduction to enzymes. We'll be talking more about enzymes later. It's an introduction to how protein forms structures within the cell. A full copy of DNA goes into baby cells, and parts of DNA, namely genes, can be transferred between bacterial cells in the process of horizontal gene transfer. Well, let me know if you have any questions about this material. I am more than happy to answer questions.